Hello, welcome back to Transform Your Workplace. I'm your host, Brandon Laws. Today, we have a fantastic episode lined up with Amy Edmondson, a Harvard Business School professor and a leading expert on organizational behavior. I had her on in 2019 discussing a couple of her books, and today we're discussing her latest book, The Right Kind of Wrong, The Science of Failing Well. This came out about a year ago, and it's on top of a ton of charts and getting so much recognition. In this conversation I had with Amy, she explains why failure isn't just unavoidable, it's actually essential for growth and innovation. We talk about how to embrace intelligent failure and learn from our mistakes to move forward. Amy also shares her own experiences with failure, including how she discovered the concept of psychological safety, which is all about creating a work environment where people feel safe to take risks and speak up. And that's what we're all about on this podcast. So before we jump in, I want to give a big shout out to our sponsor, Xenium HR. They're dedicated to helping leaders grow through excellent learning and development programs like on-demand learning, virtual workshops, and a People Leadership Foundations cohort. That's an 8-week module. So if you're looking to make a real impact in your organization or help your people grow, definitely go to xeniumhr.com and check out the programs. And if you enjoyed today's conversation with Amy Edmondson, please like, subscribe, and share this episode with your network. Let's spread the word about the power of learning from intelligent failure. All right, let's dive into the conversation with Amy Edmondson. Amy, it is such a pleasure to have you on Transform Your Workplace for the second time. Thanks for coming back.
Thanks for having me.
We're going to talk about your book. It's been out for a year now. I think you're celebrating the anniversary of it. It's The Right Kind of Wrong, The Science of Failing Well. And this book is on all sorts of charts. It's got tons of great 5-star ratings and reviews. So congratulations on the release of this book.
Thank you so much for that.
You wrote early on in the book that if you're not failing, you're not journeying into a new territory. Why do you believe that? And can you share maybe a story about your own failure that led to the discovery of psychological safety, which has been talked about by a lot of different people now that you've released that work?
Well, sure. So the reason I say if you're not failing, you're not journeying into new territory is that new territory, by definition, is a place where you don't know enough yet. You haven't mastered it yet. So whether that's picking up a new instrument or, pottery class or leading a project that you've never led before at work, it's new territory. And in new territory, there will be things you have to do that you've never done before, and not all of them will come out perfectly every time. It's just a fact, right? Or it's a prediction of a fact. But it's a little hard to imagine. It would be irrational to think that you could sort of just blithely go into new territory, pick up a new sport, and be great at it the first time. And as you said, this is an intuition I came to through direct personal experience, probably many, many direct personal experiences. But the one I open this new book with is a story of a big research project in my second year of graduate school. And the aim of the project, or at least my research aim, was to show that better teamwork in the healthcare delivery setting to teaching hospitals in Boston, that better teamwork would lead to lower adverse drug events, which are bad medical outcomes that happen as a result of human error. There are adverse drug events that don't involve error, but these were just bad events, failures, if you will, that involved people making mistakes that didn't get caught in time to prevent. And so that seems like a pretty good hypothesis, right? I mean, if you're making, if you've got really good teamwork, good coordination, good relationships, you're going to have fewer such bad outcomes. But when I finally got the data, after 6 months of people collecting data on the error rates and my team survey data and put them together, not only was the hypothesis not supported, it was supported in the wrong direction. And so I didn't just fail to support my hypothesis. I was 180 degrees wrong, according to the data. The data were saying that better teamwork was associated with higher, not lower, error rates. Now, that was a shock, a disappointment, pretty scary in that moment. And rather than just run away, flee, as I was tempted to do, I sat down to really give this some thought. And it suddenly occurred to me that maybe the better teams don't make more mistakes. Maybe they're more willing to talk about them, to report them. And with that, you might think, well, anyway, let me put it differently. If they're more willing to report them, they're more able to catch and correct, and then ultimately reduce harm. But also they're learning. They're learning from each other. They're learning as they're going. They're improving quality every day because of that honesty and transparency. Much later, I called those differences in interpersonal climate. The kind of climate where you think, of course, I'm going to speak up. I don't care how hard it is. I will do it because it's expected. It's what we do around here. Much later, I called that kind of climate psychological safety. But this was quite by accident. I had just stumbled into the possibility that different teams in the same organizational context had different reporting climates or speaking up climates. And that turns out to be a pretty robust phenomenon, that within organizations around the world, you will often find different teams have different norms, different levels of confidence that their voice is welcome.
In introducing that story about that failure, you call this intelligent failure. How does this differ from, say, errors or mistakes?
Well, an error or a mistake, they're virtually synonymous, is an unintended deviation from a known process or practice or knowledge base. And so if, let's say, I'd done this research project and I'd entered the data in the wrong columns, that would have been a mistake. It would have been a preventable mistake. It would have been, it would have given me lousy results. And then I could have had a failure to support the hypothesis, but it would have been a basic failure, not an intelligent failure. So, because I sort of literally did something wrong. But in this case, I hadn't. I'd entered the data carefully. I'd run the statistical analysis accurately. The data just didn't show up the way I wanted them to. So an intelligent failure is the undesired result. Ask any scientist. You'd much rather be right than wrong. The undesired result of a thoughtful foray into new territory, whether that's a little kid learning to ride a bike and, falling over a few times. Intelligent failure. There's opportunity here. It's new. You're not good at it yet. You fail more often than you succeed early on in any new activity, and in scientific endeavors, of course, research endeavors. But it's intelligent in part because it brings great new intelligence. It brings new knowledge. And in part because there's literally no way to know in advance, right? That if you do all your homework, you read the literature, you talk to experts, and you've got a hypothesis, the only way to know whether it works or not is to try it. And if lo and behold, you're wrong, that's an intelligent failure.
Yeah. How does psychological safety play a role in intelligent failing? Because I would imagine that you need some sort of environment where you can lean into the failure, ask the questions why, venture off into that new territory, as you said.
Yeah, so I think psychological safety plays two roles. One is, as you just implied, in helping people have the thoughtful conversations they need to prepare. And so that willingness to ask for help, to ask people what they think of this crazy thing you're about to try. So in that sense, the psychological safety for allowing you to have candid, brave conversations is an important precursor to coming up with good hypotheses and, good experiments. The other way that psychological safety helps is it just creates room for risk taking, right? And instead of feeling like you have to play it safe and you have to, everything better go well. So you better just, kind of play not to lose, as it were. It allows you to take smart risks.
You, as you said before, you draw an important distinction between mistakes and failures. Do you think organizations are good about recognizing the difference and even leaning into the failures where you describe as intelligent failure? That's where the risk taking, that's where the that's where we could probably innovate a lot more. Our
No,
organizations get this.
This is exactly why I wrote the book, right? Because everything I write,
Yeah.
I believe, is fairly logical, but it turns out to not be intuitive,
Yeah.
and especially not in the workplace. When you go into organizations, I think by and large, people have a hard time having the proper emotional reaction to different kinds of failures. Like an intelligent failure, sure, it's disappointing, but it's valid new data, and we should be excited by it and grateful for it. Whereas, basic failures, not so good, especially the same basic failure several times in a row, definitely not so good. But my research, my experience has taught me that organizations by and large do not do a good enough job of differentiating between different types of undesired outcomes and learning how to celebrate, really call positive attention to the learnings in new territory, while also finding ways to prevent basic failures through training, again, often through speaking up, through encouraging psychological safety so that people can speak up in a timely way, say if they don't know how to do something, and thereby prevent some preventable failures.
To help people listening and organizations determine the differences between some of these failures, you categorize them in three different ways. You talked about basic, we talked about intelligence, and then you have complex. Maybe explain the differences between each, and if you can think of an example of one in each category, would be great.
Yep. So a basic failure has a single simple cause, usually human error. Sad example would be you text and drive and you get into an accident. Right? It's utterly, you've made a mistake. You shouldn't be texting and driving. It's negligent, right? In fact, many basic failures are caused by negligence, even sort of failing to do your preventative maintenance and leading to a breakdown in your car or your house, that was absolutely preventable. So basic failures are simple, single cause, and quite preventable. Complex failures have multiple causes. They are the perfect storms. They may be caused by a variety of several factors, inside and outside, inside the organization and outside the market conditions, what have you. And what distinguishes them from basic failures is primarily that any one of those causes all by itself would not lead to failure. It's only the confluence of factors that causes, the failure. So let's say, a delivery failure during a global pandemic, right? You don't get the parts you need to then put together and deliver the products you have promised your customers. And if you try to figure out what happened here, turns out there was, bad weather in the Philippines. There were people not showing up for work because they were sick due to the virus, and it's not one thing, it's like 10 things. And they all came together in the wrong way and created a failure in your factory. And then intelligent failure, right? The undesired result of a thoughtful foray into new territory. They basically have 4 attributes. Territory is new, in pursuit of a goal. You've done your homework. You've got a thoughtful hypothesis that you're testing. And the failure is no bigger than it has to be to get the new knowledge, right? It's not, you don't bet the whole farm on an uncertain investment. You're taking small bets, small tests. And a good example of an intelligent failure is the one I gave before, but any research scientist who has done her homework, read the literature, and is on the leading edge of some field, say chemistry, and is running an experiment that she absolutely hopes and expects has the possibility to succeed and be right, but alas, it's wrong, that's an intelligent failure. And intelligent failures are the bread and butter for scientists and inventors and innovators, and even elite athletes and others.
When you're discussing these types of failures in the book, you had a really cool graphic that I love. On one side, there's a continuum of uncertainty, and then the other had preventability. How do these relate to the three?
Yeah.
And why did you choose those?
Yes. Well, I think, intuitively we feel like we should be preventing failures, like all of them. And the reality is we can't prevent all of them. And some of them we don't even want to prevent, right? We want to have them so that we can make progress in new territory. So as we go from basic to complex to intelligent, uncertainty goes up, right? I mean, you're more and more in new territory. Basic, it's very familiar, very well understood domain. Don't text and drive, right? And complex. There's an awful lot going on. I'm doing my best to be on top of all the factors that could affect the success of my project, but there will be some outside my control or some I didn't really think of. So it's just a little bit more complex, a little bit more uncertain. And then intelligent, I am deliberately standing, on the front lines of experience where we don't yet know what happens next. And so, there's high uncertainty and no preventability at all. So basic failures are often, quite highly preventable. Complex failures, if you speak up quickly and do your best and really try to stay vigilant, we can prevent a lot of them, but not 100%, because again, global pandemic comes in from stage left, and there really wasn't much any one of us could have done about that, at least as individuals, right? The perfect storm indeed. Whereas of the three types, intelligent failures theoretically are the only one that are completely not preventable, right? They're not preventable because they are bets in new territory. So if you're preventing them all, you're not doing your job. You're not innovating.
How does fear play a role in each of these types of failures? It seems like it's probably smack dab in the middle in the complex failure, but I'm curious how maybe it impacts all of those failures.
That's so interesting because, there's fear. Like I'm afraid of something going wrong for good reason, right? It might be economic risk. It might be human safety risk. And then there's interpersonal fear and they're really two different things. And interpersonal fear is that fear I have of, I don't want to look bad in front of a colleague or a manager. And so I hold back. I need help, but I don't ask for it. And then something bad actually happens. So that is absolutely counterproductive fear. But there is some fear that's productive. Like, you should be afraid of that damn virus and because it could make you sick. And so, doing what you can to protect yourself against the virus or against your child running out into the street after a lost ball, those are healthy fears. Those are fears that we want to use to stay safe in truly dangerous situations. But the irony is that interpersonal fear often makes us unsafe, right? Because we don't get the help we need, or we don't speak up to help someone else who's about to make an error of some kind. Fear plays an absolutely vital role in keeping us safe and keeping us, healthy and alive. But it is interpersonal fear that we have to try to drive out of the organization.
Learning from failure seems really straightforward. And I think you even alluded to that in the book, but it's often hindered by psychological and cultural barriers inside of our workplace and society. What are some of the most effective ways that you've seen individuals and teams really internalize the lessons from failure and venture off in a new territory?
Yeah. Great question. And, first of all, it is easy to shortchange the reflection on failure because, confronting failures is not fun. It's aversive. Let's move. Okay, it didn't work. Let's move on. But don't, when you get a failure in a workplace, you have essentially, you can think of it as an investment, right? You've spent the money already. Now get your money's worth, which means get the lessons from it. Best practices for getting the lessons is two things. One, multi-perspective, right? It's a team sport. If you've got a failure that has happened in a project, I can almost guarantee you that different people will have seen different parts of the elephant. They will have slightly different perspectives based on where they were, on their area of expertise, their activities during the project. And so just pausing to get those different perspectives. And secondly, using the following question to get started. What happened? Let's look at what happened, not why and not who. Those maybe are questions for a little bit later, but start with the what. Let's tell the story. Let's tell the story of this failure as accurately and holistically as we possibly can. And that discipline to say what happened and get the answer from different viewpoints cools the temperature makes it less emotional, makes it more of a like a lab report. Let's actually look at how the events unfolded, and then as we are getting a fuller picture of how the events unfolded, we can begin to take a look at the important question of what the contributions were. And we should each be willing to say things that we may have done that it contributed in part, not through bad intentions, but just things we missed or things we didn't fully understand, or maybe we were distracted or busy, whatever. Talk about what I need to talk about what I did. You need to talk about what you did. And those are both, omission and commission, things I did, but also things that, I could have done. I could have done that second check on the shipment before it went out. And I thought about it, but then I was in a hurry and I didn't do it. And I'm sorry.
And it does seem like that type of debrief on the situation is part of like that systems thinking. Like a lot of our organizations, like things happen upstream that affect downstream. And so debriefing like that probably gets us to understand like this impacted that and how it's all connected. Is there an approach outside of what you just described that would help us understand like the differences between like quick fixes in the moment? And it's probably easier said than done. Like when you look back, it's hindsight's 2020, right? But when you're in the here and now, it's tough.
It's true. Well, basic failures are conducive to quick fixes. It's sort of like, well, let's not do that again. And here's how. But certainly complex failures and intelligent failures preclude quick fixes, and yet quick fixes are always a temptation. We want to just fix and move on. Like, I don't want to dwell on this, and I'm not saying dwell on it. I'm saying get your money's worth, right? Learn from it, and depending on how complex it was, the remedies may be either complex or uncertain. Like, there may be some things we have to try, like, what about if, we agreed to start meetings, 7 minutes after the hour or whatever? I mean, we could brainstorm some practices that we might try next to increase the chances that we avoid that kind of failure. Team sport.
Yeah. In your book, you had a great section on social media and how, I think especially with Instagram, it encourages individuals to share only the good, only the perfect. And I think it creates this culture of perfection and comparison, which is super dangerous. How do you see this dynamic playing out in the workplace?
Well, it's I guess we'd have to say it's a parallel. There's a parallel. First of all, I think social media is inadvertently training us in some bad habits, right? And not just the habits of scrolling and all that stuff that has been widely discussed, but kind of the habits of putting forward an overly sanitized view of ourselves, because that's, of course, what people post, and, putting forward just the good news, not the bad. So, I like to say to people managers in any industry, I'll say, like, let's stop and think for a minute. Like last week, how much of what you heard was red versus green, dissent or problems, or I need help, or, I've got a failure over here, versus agreement and progress and all's well and success. And I said, if you're hearing only green or largely green, first of all, I know you had a better week. But second of all, it's probably not reality. Just because, we're operating in a volatile, uncertain, complex world, right? It cannot be that everything's green. So if you're only hearing green, A, you probably have a psychological safety problem, and B, you better go on a treasure hunt to find more red. And so, that's kind of the equivalent of social media, but maybe it's training us to do even more of this. And in friendship, I mean friendship. Friendship at work, colleagueship, sort of relationship and relating to other people. I think in the past, there was always a point with a sort of a new colleague or a new friend where you get beyond the just, self-presentation part of a relationship, and you start being a little more honest and open and vulnerable. And that's the moment where you sort of go from just an acquaintance to a friend, right? That's the moment where, and in fact, that's actually the moment we like each other more, because suddenly you have revealed yourself to me as a real person, a fallible human being who has some of the same worries, or maybe different ones, but you have worries, you have anxieties, you have, insecurities. And we're now relating to each other. And this makes life more joyful, not less, right? Whereas if I'm just getting your happy face and your, perfect photos version of yourself, and I'm just giving you that of me, we're distant, we're cold, we're not really connecting. And boy, it makes for a longer day.
It's interesting because I still think Instagram is like this perfectionist
Yeah.
type of environment. LinkedIn used to be like that, and it was almost cringeworthy because it'd just be people just sharing their successes, and I'm so proud and blah blah blah. I'm actually starting to see it shift a little bit. People are now sharing failures or even some things in their personal life, and I see it connecting people better. It's like in the workplace where we might open up to a colleague or an employee and help strengthen that relationship. I'm starting to see that on LinkedIn as well. And I think people are consuming that type of content.
I agree. And I think it's very healthy, right? I mean, it does. LinkedIn feels more like it's a professional space, to be sure, but it feels like more like a real community, or at least some real connections are being forged.
You talked earlier about how fields like sciences and athletics tend to have a healthier relationship with failure. What distinguishes those two groups from the rest of us? And how do we maybe adopt some of those practices?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most obvious distinguishing factor is that they have to experience failure more often, right? If you really want to be excellent in some sports area, if you want to be an elite athlete, you are going to have lots of failures. Roger Federer famously at a Dartmouth graduation gave a talk where he said that he won 54% of his matches, right? I mean, he's a tennis god, right? He's a one in a generation kind of talent. And that's like
right. Marginally different
than a coin toss, almost, right? It's like a heavy coin, right? Marginally different than a coin toss. So what do we take away from that? We take that enormous success, true success, has come from a willingness to tolerate failure. And so I think, elite athletes or scientists, the same thing. If you're a scientist, depending on what field you're in, the rate of or the ratio of successes to failures is going to be low. It could be 10% successes. It could be 20, it could be 30. It depends on the field. But it will not be 90, right? So if you want to be a scientist and you want to operate, at the top of your profession, you're not going to last very long unless you sort of develop some failure muscles. And so I think that's what they have in common, is that the only path toward excellence is through failures.
Speaking of strengthening that failure muscle, how can we use concepts like reframing or growth mindset to help have more intelligent failures?
Growth mindset, growth mindset is, in a way, it's a reframing. And, framing, the idea of framing refers to the cognitive structures inside our heads that we're unaware of, but they're there, right? So when, we are looking at the reality of our own experiences through cognitive structures, through beliefs and biases that you can think of as a frame. And then reframing is to sort of deliberately say, maybe the frame I'm spontaneously using isn't the most productive. So you say, let me switch that around. I mean, let's say I'm a scientist who can't bear failure, and every time my hypothesis is wrong and the data don't cooperate, I'm thinking, I'm a loser, I'm a failure, I'm never getting anywhere. A, it's possibly not true, probably not true. And B, it's not going to help you. It's not going to help you achieve your goals and achieve some success. So unless that scientist figures out how to reframe these frustrating, disappointing events as stepping stones on the way to potentially a really great discovery. So, for example, a reframe might be stepping stone. Another reframe might be, wow, that's valuable new information that I did not have yesterday. Right? I now know something more about how these cells behave. And so that's like money in the bank. And now with that knowledge, I'm going to come up with a new and better hypothesis, and then another one, and then another one. And so the reframe is kind of, thank you, nature, thank you, universe, for giving me new information that helps me get a tiny step closer to where I'm trying to go. And it's not only, a healthy, psychologically healthy reframe, it's also objectively, intellectually accurate.
For leaders who are more risk averse, maybe in the financial industry, or maybe they have reputational stakes, what advice would you offer on how to approach failure in a way that balances like caution, but with the potential of innovation?
Be smart, right? I mean, they know that already. But here I mean, investments actually have very interesting context because they have long known, they recognize the trade between risk and reward. Right? They recognize that you can deliberately keep risks low, like invest in commodities and kind of things that have very little upside, but are not likely to just absolutely crash either. And then you'll make a sort of predictable but tiny return. Or you can invest in very high risk stocks, new companies, new innovations that might absolutely fail, leave you with nothing, or might give you a multiple of many times over return, $20 to the one. So it's, investors know that they must, and so they figure out where they like to live. They know that they must find a place that they can tolerate on that spectrum, from taking safe bets to taking risky bets. And of course, a portfolio, most investors think in terms of a portfolio where they're going to balance some of the riskier bets with safer bets. Now, most of us, lay people in our lives or, managers in other industries don't intuitively take that same approach, but it's a good approach, right? In your life, you don't want everything in your life to, go south at once. That's just not going to be tolerable, really. So, you think carefully about where are the risks that I want to take, and where are the places I'm okay, playing it safe for a little while.
Amy, we covered a lot of ground. We covered areas of your book. There's so much more we didn't cover, but if there's any like last word or anything that we didn't cover that you want to make sure the listeners hear, I'd love to hear it.
Well, I think that people can have more fun and more success when they're equipped with the framework for failing well, right? And when they're thoughtful about context. I think the book brings lots of sort of life and work lessons for a successful path forward. And I also think it's the kind of knowledge and conversation that's really fun to share with other people.
My guest today has been Amy Edmondson, the author of the new book, Right Kind of Wrong, The Science of Failing Well. Amy, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Appreciate you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in for today's episode of Transform Your Workplace. The content on this show is strictly for general information and educational purposes only, so that you can go transform your workplace in a positive way. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on the show are the guest's own and don't represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of either Xenium HR, the sponsor of the show, or me, the host, Brandon Laws. Additionally, Xenium HR or myself, Brandon Laws, doesn't endorse any guest, their business, or any organization they represent, so discretion is advised. We encourage you to work with a trusted advisor to find a custom approach that fits your organization's needs. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode.